The morning of the auction, there were 50 sheep nobody wanted. They were a motley collection, huddled in a dusty back pen under the relentless August sun, looking less like livestock and more like a collective apology. Their wool was the color of old string, matted with burrs and stained with the grime of a long, miserable journey. They were last year's lambs that had failed to thrive, the runts of a larger flock, their ribs showing like the teeth of a broken comb through their thin coats. The auctioneer, a man whose voice was usually a booming instrument of commerce, spoke of them with a dismissive air, his words clipped and impatient, eager to be done with the sorry spectacle. The other farmers, men with sun-creased necks and hands calloused from wrestling profit from the earth, leaned against the iron railings, their arms crossed. They glanced at the pen with the casual disinterest of men, looking at something already consigned to the boneyard. These were not animals that would build a future. They were a liability, a collection of impending vet bills and wasted pasture. It was a prediction of failure. It would turn out to be a prediction of something else entirely. A Laura Kane arrived as the auctioneer was trying and failing to start the bidding on the rejected sheep. She moved through the crowd with a quietness that made her seem both out of place and invisible. She was 29, though the city had left a weariness in her eyes that made her look older. Her hands were clean and unscarred, her clothes practical but lacking the ingrained dust and fading of a life lived under the open sky. She had come back to Burnt Fork Valley not in triumph but in retreat, the inheritor of a farm that had been sinking back into the earth for 2 decades and a quiet, personal failure she never spoke of. She walked past the pens of prize-winning Angus bulls, their muscles shifting like tectonic plates beneath glossy black hides. She ignored the healthy, boisterous hogs and the pens of market-ready lambs that drew the serious bidders. Instead, she made her way to the back pen, the one everyone else ignored, and she stood there, watching the 50 sad-looking sheep for a long time, longer than seemed reasonable. She didn't look at them as a whole, a mass of failure, but seemed to study them one by one, her gaze patient and analytical, as if she were reading a text no one else could see. The auctioneer, whose name was Rayburn, sighed into his microphone. "All right, folks, let's not waste the whole day on these. Who'll give me $10 a head? $10 for the lot of them? Come on, that's dog food prices." A low chuckle went through the crowd. A few men shook their heads, a gesture that was part pity, part scorn. The sheep huddled tighter, as if they understood the judgment being passed upon them. Ilara, who had been perfectly still, raised her bidding number, a simple, unadorned piece of white plastic with the number 114 printed on it. Her movement was so small, so lacking in bravado, that Rayburn almost missed it. He squinted against the glare. "I have a bid? Ma'am? You're bidding on the whole lot?" His voice held a note of genuine surprise. Ilara simply nodded, her face unreadable. "Sold," Rayburn said, the word coming out like a gavel strike of disbelief. "To number 114, the whole sorry lot of them." A wave of murmuring rippled through the farmers, which quickly crested into open, incredulous laughter. It wasn't cruel exactly, but it was the deep, resonant laughter of men who knew the rules of this world, who understood the hard math of survival, and who had just witnessed someone break those rules in the most foolish way imaginable. As Ilara walked to the office to sign the paperwork, a voice, loud and confident, cut through the lingering amusement. "Well, she just bought 50 funerals." The speaker was Jedediah Stone, the biggest landowner in the county. He was a man built on a large scale, with a booming voice and a certainty to match. His farm was a marvel of modern efficiency, a sprawling operation of irrigated cornfields and feedlots, all financed by a healthy line of credit at the county bank. He stood surrounded by a few other farmers who nodded in agreement, their faces reflecting his own confident assessment. Jedediah wasn't trying to be malicious. He was simply stating a fact as he saw it, a truth as solid and unyielding as the granite bedrock of the valley itself. The sheep were weak. They were carrying parasites. They were poorly bred, and they would not survive the coming winter on a neglected farm run by a city girl with soft hands. He had meant it as a prediction of failure, a plain-spoken prophecy delivered before the entire congregation of the valley's agricultural faithful. It would turn out to be a prediction of something else entirely, a marker for a change that was coming, as slow and quiet and inexorable as the turning of the earth itself. The drive back to the farm was a symphony of misery. The 50 sheep, crammed into a borrowed rust-pocked stock trailer, bleated a chorus of fear and confusion that grated on Alara's nerves. The trailer swayed and rattled behind her old pickup truck, every bump in the road a percussive jolt that sent a fresh wave of panic noise from the back. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, and stared at the cracked asphalt spooling out before her. She had come home 3 months earlier, after the small graphic design firm she'd co-founded in a distant, nameless city had folded. It had not been a dramatic collapse, but a slow, quiet bleeding out of capital and enthusiasm, like a tire with a pinhole leak. Her partner had moved on to a corporate job. Her relationship had ended with a similar lack of ceremony, a quiet acknowledgement that they were simply traveling in different directions. She had found herself adrift, her life a blank page she had no idea how to fill. Then the letter had come about her grandfather's farm, a place she hadn't seen since she was a child, a place that had sat empty since his death, tended only by the slow, persistent hands of nature. The property taxes were overdue. The real estate agent called it a significant burden. When she first arrived, the burden felt crushing. The farmhouse, once a proud white sentinel at the head of the valley, was now a gray, tired ghost. Paint peeled from the clapboard in long, curling strips like sunburnt skin. The porch sagged on one end, its floorboards soft with rot. The great red barn, the heart of the old farm, leaned distinctly to the north, as if weary of standing against the wind. The pastures her grandfather had so carefully cultivated were now a wild tapestry of thistle, burdock, and Queen Anne's lace. The fences that once defined them little more than suggestions of rust and broken wire half swallowed by the overgrowth. For the first week, she did nothing but walk. She followed the ghost of old fence lines, her boots sinking into the damp, rich earth. She found the old spring house, its stone walls cool and covered in moss, the water still trickling from a pipe, clear and cold. She sat on the sagging porch and watched the sun set behind the western ridge, painting the overgrown valley in hues of gold and purple. The city, with its noise and its clean, hard lines, felt like a distant dream. There she had felt like a ghost, drifting through a life that wasn't quite hers. Here, surrounded by decay and the relentless reclamation of nature, something in her had settled. It was not a grand decision, not a moment of cinematic revelation. It was a quiet yielding, like water finding its own level. She decided not to sell the burden. She would try to understand it. The work of unloading the sheep was clumsy and frustrating. They refused to leave the trailer, huddling in the far corner, a trembling mass of fear. Finally, she managed to push and cajole them down the ramp and into a holding pen she'd hastily repaired. They immediately clustered together, heads down, looking just as miserable as they had at the auction. Alara leaned against the fence, her arms aching, her shirt soaked with sweat, and watched them. Jedediah Stone's words echoed in her mind. 50 funerals. Looking at them now, it felt less like a prophecy and more like a simple, accurate diagnosis. She felt a pang of doubt, a cold knot in her stomach that whispered she had made a terrible, public mistake. But then she looked past the sheep, at the overgrown fields, at the leaning barn, at the whole beautiful, broken inheritance spread before her. It was all of a piece. The rejected farm, the rejected sheep, the rejected woman who had come home to claim them. A stubborn spark ignited in her chest, a quiet refusal to accept the verdict that had been passed on all of them. She didn't have a plan, not really. She only had a small inheritance that was quickly dwindling, a deep-seated weariness with the modern world's definition of success, and a growing curiosity about the forgotten history buried in the soil beneath her feet. The first few weeks were a process of slow, patient observation. She spent more time watching than doing. She followed the sheep as they tentatively began to explore their new pasture, noting what they ate and what they avoided. They were wary of the lush, fast-growing grasses in the low-lying areas, preferring instead to nibble at the tough, scrubby plants on the hillsides. the wild herbs and deep-rooted weeds that other grazers would ignore. She walked the land constantly, not with the eye of an owner planning its subjugation, but with the quiet attention of a student. She learned the land's contours, the way the water flowed after a rain, where the soil was deep and black, and where it was thin and clay-ridden. The farm was not a blank slate. It was a living history, and she was slowly learning to read its language. It was on a gray, drizzly afternoon, when the dampness seemed to seep into the very bones of the old house, that she found the key. Driven inside by the rain and a sense of restless aimlessness, she had decided to clean out the attic, a task she'd been avoiding for weeks. The air up there was thick with the scent of dust and time. In a far corner, under a canvas tarp, stiff with age, sat a large leather-bound trunk, its surface covered in a fine layer of gray powder. She pried open the rusted latches, the screech of metal echoing in the quiet space. Inside, nestled in yellowed newspaper, were not the family heirlooms she expected, but a collection of 24 ledger-style notebooks. She lifted one out. On the cover, in a precise, slightly slanted hand, were the words, "Burnt Fork Farm, Year of Our Lord, 1958. She opened it. It was her grandfather's handwriting. She sat down on the dusty floorboards, the single bare bulb overhead, casting a pool of weak light, and began to read. These were not simple farm logs. They were not mere records of planting dates and harvest yields. They were the life's work of a philosopher whose subject was this single patch of earth. They were the field notes of a man studying something he loved. He wrote about the weather not just as data, but as a conversation the sky was having with the land. He documented the arrival of the first barn swallows each spring and the day the crickets fell silent in the fall. He had sketched detailed drawings of plants most farmers considered weeds, plantain, chicory, dandelion, thistle, with notes on their root structures and the minerals they brought up from the deep soil. One entry read, "The south field is tired today. The chicory is pushing up along the eastern edge. A good sign. The earth is asking for a rest and sending up the cure at the same time." Ilara read for hours, the rain drumming a gentle rhythm on the roof above her. A philosophy began to emerge from the pages. A way of seeing the world that was patient, holistic, and profoundly at odds with the modern agricultural ethos represented by men like Jedediah Stone. Her grandfather wrote about the soil as a living entity, a community of organisms that needed to be fed and rested, not a sterile medium to be pumped full of chemicals. He wrote about animals not as production units, but as partners in the work of the farm. And then she found it, a section on sheep. He wrote about the very same breed she had just bought, a hardy old-world line that had fallen out of favor for the bigger, faster-growing commercial breeds. "They look like nothing," he wrote, "so nobody bothers them. They have not had the sense bred out of them. They know how to live on what's given, not what's bought. They are the animal for the farmer who has more time than money." And then, underlined twice, a phrase that made her sit up straight, "The ground remembers." It was a central thesis, repeated in various forms throughout the decades of notes. The land held the memory of its own health, and if you listened, it would tell you how to restore it. He also wrote about finances with the same sober clarity. "Debt," one entry declared, "is a man telling the future what it has to do. It is a yoke you place on the neck of your children. Farm with what you have. Grow the way a tree grows, season by season, not the way a fire grows." A few days later, with a half dozen of the notebooks tucked into a canvas bag, Ilara drove to the other side of the county to see her great-aunt Maeve, her grandfather's younger sister. Maeve was 89 and lived in a small, neat-as-a-pin house that smelled of wood smoke and dried lavender. She was a woman carved from hickory, terse and practical, who still wore her late husband's flannel shirts and split her own firewood. Ilara found her on the back porch, sharpening the blade of a hoe with a whetstone. Maeve looked up as she approached, her eyes, roomy but sharp, taking in Ilara, the bag, and the purpose of the visit in a single, swift glance. "Heard you bought the dregs at the auction," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Her voice was raspy, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. Ilara didn't flinch. "I did," she said, and laid the notebooks on the small table between them. Maeve looked at them but didn't touch them. "He wrote it all down," she said, a hint of something, not quite fondness. more like weary respect, in her tone. Never thought anyone would bother to read it. He was always out of step. Good. Less work for me to explain it. She finally picked up one of the books, her gnarled fingers tracing the handwriting. He knew things, listened more than he talked. People thought he was slow. He wasn't slow. He was just paying attention. Ilara felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees. She explained what she'd read about the sheep, about the land. She asked Maeve if it was all true, if it could possibly work. Maeve just grunted. The ground doesn't lie. People do. Banks do. The ground tells the truth if you know how to listen. Then she looked at Ilara, her gaze sharp and penetrating. Your grandfather always said, when you're looking at a pen of animals, don't look at the ones at the edge. The sick ones and the bullies go to the edge. The tough ones, the smart ones, they huddle in the middle. They know how to borrow warmth and how to share it. You buy the middle. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't consciously chosen the sheep that way, but she realized with a jolt of recognition that her long observation at the auction had been an unconscious sorting. She had been drawn to the quiet center of the flock, the ones who were simply enduring, waiting. She had bought the middle. The work began in earnest. It was slow, unglamorous, and mostly invisible to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. Armed with her grandfather's notebooks and Maeve's blunt confirmation, Ilara started to translate the faded ink into physical reality. Her first task was fencing. The notebooks were adamant about rotational grazing, moving the flock through small paddocks to graze the plants down, then giving the pasture months to recover. She didn't have the money for a new fence, so she spent weeks walking the old lines, pulling the rusted wire from the weeds, untangling it, and painstakingly splicing it back together. She used an old, heavy post-hole digger she found in the barn, her soft city hands quickly blistering, then callousing over. The work was grueling, a monotonous rhythm of digging, setting posts, and stretching wire until her muscles screamed in protest. Every evening she would collapse onto the porch, aching and covered in dirt, and watch the sheep in their new small enclosure. She wasn't just building fences. She was rebuilding the memory of the land, one small piece at a time. She followed the notebook's guidance on what to clear and what to leave. She didn't plow the fields under. Instead, she used a scythe, another tool from the barn's dusty arsenal, to clear small patches, leaving the deep-rooted weeds her grandfather had prized. The work was a meditation, the rhythmic swing of the blade a counterpoint to the frantic, debt-fueled pace of the farms around her. To a passing driver on the county road, it would have looked like madness, a woman trying to tame a wilderness with a hand tool. The county's true circulatory system was Pratt's Feed and Seed, a cavernous building that smelled of molasses-rich grain, leather, and dry dust. It was where news and gossip were exchanged with the same weight as currency. Elias Pratt, the owner, was a quiet, stooped man in his 70s who had inherited the store from his father, just as Ilara had inherited her farm. He moved slowly, but missed nothing. It was here that Ilara's folly was a recurring topic of conversation. Jedediah Stone, holding court near the counter, would often greet her with a booming, false friendliness. Well, if it isn't the shepherdess of Burnt Fork, he'd say, a grin spreading across his face. How are the invalids, Ilara? Still breathing? His lieutenants, the other farmers who orbited his success, would chuckle along with him. One day he saw her loading a single bag of minerals into her truck. Heard you're raising thorns over there. The sheep eating them? He asked, his voice dripping with condescending humor. The other men laughed. They saw her small, careful purchases, her patched-up clothes, her dogged, lonely work, and they saw a confirmation of their own judgment. She was playing at farming, a hobbyist destined for a rude awakening when the first snow fell. Ilara's response to this relentless, low-grade mockery was the most powerful tool she had. She refused to be baited. She would meet Jedediah's booming questions with a level gaze and a plain, unadorned answer. They seem to like them, she said in response to the jibe about the thorns, her voice flat and free of any defensiveness. She paid Elias for the minerals, nodded a polite goodbye, and left. Her refusal to engage, her lack of anger or shame, took the fun out of the game. It was like arguing with the weather. It gave them nothing to push against. Her quiet confidence left an awkward silence in her wake, a vacuum that the men's laughter couldn't quite fill. They were expecting a fight or a plea for help, and when she gave them neither, they were left feeling vaguely foolish, as if the joke had somehow turned back on them. They didn't understand that her confidence wasn't rooted in pride, but in the pages of her grandfather's notebooks. She wasn't arguing with them because she was having a much deeper conversation with the land, and it was beginning to whisper back. One afternoon, after Jedediah and his cohort had left the store, Ilara was counting out her change to pay for a spool of wire when Elias Pratt spoke, his voice low and raspy. He was leaning on the counter, wiping it down with a damp rag, a ritual she'd seen him perform 100 times. "Don't pay them any mind," he said, not looking at her directly. "They laughed at your granddad, too." Ilara looked up, surprised. Elias continued, his gaze fixed on the worn wooden counter. "He started doing all this, rotating the pasture, leaving the weeds. My dad said everyone in the valley thought he'd lost his mind, said he was farming backwards." He paused, then looked at her, his eyes clear and direct. Then the blight of '68 hit, wiped out half the corn in the county. Your granddad's fields were fine. He said the soil was healthy enough to fight it off. After that, they didn't laugh so much. They just stayed quiet. He finished wiping the counter and rang up her purchase. "He used to say a healthy farm has more weeds than a sick one. Took me 30 years to figure out what he meant by that." It was the first piece of external validation Ilara had received, a small, cracked window into the past. It was a gift, a confirmation that the path she was on, as lonely and difficult as it was, had been walked before. She drove home that day feeling a little less like an island, and a little more like a link in a chain. As autumn deepened, painting the valley in fiery shades of crimson and gold, the first tangible signs of success began to appear. The change in the sheep was no longer a matter of faith, but a visible fact. Their coats, once thin and ragged, had grown in thick and dense, the natural lanolin making them gleam in the low afternoon sun. They were no longer the skeletal figures from the auction. Their bodies had filled out, their movements sure-footed and energetic. They moved as a single cohesive unit, a river of gray wool flowing across the hillsides, guided by a collective intelligence she was only just beginning to appreciate. Then came the lambs. One crisp October morning, she found the first one, tucked beside its mother, a small, sturdy creature that was on its feet and nursing within the hour. Soon there were more. They were smaller than the commercial lambs born on other farms, but they were vigorous and hardy, born into the world with a toughness that seemed to reflect the land itself. Ilara began her own notebook, just as her grandfather had. In a plain, black-covered ledger, she noted the births, the pasture rotations, the subtle changes in the land. She wrote it all down without ceremony, but after making the entry for the 10th healthy lamb, she closed the book, walked out onto the porch, and simply sat with it. She watched the flock spread across the hillside in the fading light, the lambs frolicking while their mothers grazed peacefully. It was a quiet, profound satisfaction, a feeling as deep and solid as the earth beneath her. The first sales happened almost by accident. As Easter approached the following spring, Elias Pratt had called her. His usual supplier for lamb had fallen through. He asked hesitantly if she might be willing to part with one of hers for his family's dinner. He confessed he was curious. Ilara agreed. She selected a young ram, and the next week, Elias called her again. His voice was different, stripped of its usual laconic reserve. It was filled with a quiet awe. "Ilara," he said, "I'm 72 years old. I've eaten lamb my whole life. I have never ever tasted anything like that." He said it wasn't just good, it was different. It tasted, he struggled to explain, of herbs and wildness and clean air. It tasted of the valley itself. He asked if he could buy another. Then he told a few of his regular customers. Word of mouth, the most powerful currency in a small community, began to build. It started slowly, a quiet murmur. A neighbor bought a lamb, then told his cousin. A local chef from a town over heard the rumor and drove out, skeptical. He left with 2 and an order for more. Ilara never advertised, never created a brand. The name for her enterprise emerged organically from the community itself. People would come to Pratt's and ask if he had any of that burnt fork lamb, naming it for the creek that wound its way through her property. The name stuck. It was a brand built not on marketing, but on memory, on the unique flavor of a place allowed to be itself. That summer the rain stopped. At first its absence was a welcome respite, a string of perfect, sun-drenched days. But the days turned into weeks, and the weeks bled into a month, then two. The sky remained a vast, empty canvas of pale, hazy blue. The heat was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered the valley from dawn till dusk. The creeks and ponds, which had flowed full and deep in the spring, began to shrink. The burnt fork itself, usually a lively, chattering presence, slowed to a sluggish crawl, its banks widening into muddy flats that baked and cracked under the sun. The land began to show its thirst. The lush green of the surrounding farms faded to a sickly yellow-green, then to a brittle, uniform brown. The sound of the valley changed. The air, once filled with the buzz of insects and the songs of birds, grew quiet. The dominant sound became the chugging groan of irrigation pumps, running day and night, pulling precious water from the dwindling aquifer. Then, one by one, those pumps began to fall silent as wells ran dry. It was the worst drought in living memory, a slow, creeping catastrophe that was strangling the life out of the county. The devastation on the conventional farms was swift and brutal. Jedediah Stone's sprawling cornfields, the pride of his operation, withered on the stalk, the leaves turning a papery, lifeless brown. His pastures, planted with shallow-rooted commercial grasses, turned to dust. The hard, baked earth offered no sustenance. He was forced to sell off half his cattle herd at a catastrophic loss, the auction pens now crowded with the desperate sales of farmers trying to cut their losses. He spent a fortune trucking in expensive hay from 3 states away and water from the municipal supply, but it was like trying to fill the ocean with a teaspoon. The debt he had leveraged to build his empire was now a tightening noose around his neck. It was during the height of this crisis that the miracle of Burnt Fork Farm revealed itself. While the rest of the county turned to a monochrome brown, Ilara's valley remained a startling, defiant island of green. The deep-rooted plants her grandfather had written about, the chicory, the plantain, the resilient native grasses, were tapping into moisture far below the surface, moisture the shallow-rooted commercial crops couldn't reach. Her pastures were not lush, but they were alive. Her sheep, accustomed to foraging, thrived. They ate the dry leaves of the thistles and the tough stems of the herbs, converting the hardy, drought-resistant plants into milk for their lambs. Her spring-fed creek, though diminished, still flowed, a silver thread in the green tapestry. People began to talk. Then they began to drive out. They would park their trucks on the county road overlooking her farm and just stare, their faces a mixture of disbelief and wonder. They looked at the impossible green of her land, then at their own cracked brown fields, and for the first time, the skeptics began to understand. They were not just looking at a successful farm. They were looking at a different way of being in the world, one they had laughed at, and one that was now undeniably triumphant. One sweltering afternoon in late August, a year to the day after the auction, Ilara was sitting on her porch, mending a tear in a canvas bag, when she saw a cloud of dust rising from the lane that led to her house. A big, newish Ford F250, a truck she recognized instantly, rumbled into her yard and came to a stop. The engine cut out, and the sudden silence felt immense. Jedediah Stone sat in the driver's seat for a long time, his hands on the steering wheel, just looking. He looked at the green pasture that sloped down from the house. He looked at the flock of sheep grazing peacefully under the shade of an old oak tree. He looked at the simple, unadorned evidence of a system that worked while his own was collapsing. Finally, the driver's side door opened with a weary creak. He was a big man, but he seemed diminished, the usual boisterous confidence gone from his posture. He walked towards the porch slowly, his boots scuffing in the dry dirt, his gaze sweeping over the scene. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and took off his hat, holding it in both hands in front of him, a gesture of supplication she had never imagined she would see from him. His face was haggard, etched with new lines of worry. The sun had baked his own fields into a sterile wasteland. and the reflection of that failure was clear in his eyes. He looked past Alara, at her land, then back at her. The words when they came were quiet, stripped of all their usual bluster. They were not an apology, not a plea for forgiveness. They were a simple, stark confession, delivered not as praise for her, but as a kind of grievance against the order of things as he had understood them. "I was wrong," he said. He said it plainly, like a man stating his own weight or his own name. It was a fact that had been forced upon him, and he was here to acknowledge it. He looked at her sheep, the descendants of the flock he had derided as funerals, now fat and healthy with a new generation of strong lambs at their sides. "You were right." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of his collapsed certainty and her quiet, unyielding vindication. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't say anything. She just nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and waited. Jedediah was a practical man above all else. His visit was not just about admitting error, it was about survival. "How?" he asked, the single word carrying the weight of his entire crumbling enterprise. "How did you do this?" He wasn't asking for a secret ingredient or a magic bullet. He understood now that he was looking at a system, a whole philosophy. He was a drowning man asking how to swim. "I need to know," he said, his voice raw with a desperation he could no longer hide. "I'll pay you. I'll buy your breeding stock. My north pasture borders your land. I'll lease it to you for $1 a year if you'll just show me what you did." He was offering not just his money but his land, his pride, his deference. He was a general surrendering his sword and asking for a place in the opposing army's boot camp. Ilara thought of her grandfather's notebooks, of the pages filled with a wisdom that had been dismissed as foolishness. She thought of the slow, patient work, the quiet conversation with the land. "It's not for sale," she said calmly. Jedediah's face fell. "But I'll teach you," she added. "I'll show you." Jedediah Stone's conversion did what Alara's success alone could not. His public surrender to her methods sent a shockwave through the valley. He, the loudest of the skeptics, the high priest of high-input agriculture, began to follow her lead. He started by mending the fence between his north pasture and her land, and under her guidance, he put a small herd of his own cattle on it, rotating them through paddocks just as she did with her sheep. The sight of Jedediah Stone, on foot, moving a temporary fence line, was a more powerful sermon than any she could have preached. Soon other farmers began to visit Burnt Fork Farm. They came not with jokes, but with questions. Their hats in their hands, their faces etched with the same worried pragmatism that had driven Jedediah to her door. Alara became a teacher. She didn't lecture or gloat. She walked them through her fields. She had them kneel down and scoop up handfuls of her soil, showing them the dark, crumbly aggregate structure, the earthworms, the sweet, clean smell of living earth. Then she would walk them to the edge of her property and have them look at their own soil, a fine, pale dust that blew away in the wind. The contrast was the only lesson they needed. One day, a quiet teenager from a neighboring farm started showing up after school. His name was Sam. He was lanky and serious, with hands that seemed too big for his wrists. He didn't say much. He just asked if she needed help with chores. Ilara was hesitant at first, but she agreed, offering him a fair hourly wage. Sam was a hard worker, but it was his way of watching that set him apart. He observed everything with a deep, still intensity that reminded Ilara of herself in those first few weeks. He didn't need long explanations. When she showed him how to move the temporary fencing, he seemed to intuitively understand the purpose behind it, the rhythm of graze and rest. He had, as Maeve would have said, the hands for it. He was absorbing the knowledge not as a set of instructions, but as a language. He represented the future, the successful transmission of the ancestral legacy to a new generation. Her grandfather's words, once confined to dusty notebooks, were now taking root not just in the soil, but in the minds of her neighbors and in the quiet, capable hands of the boy who worked beside her. With the drought, the demand for burnt fork lamb, and now for her breeding stock, exploded. A banker from the county seat, the same one who held the notes on Jedediah Stone's operation, paid her a visit. He walked her land, his city shoes covered in dust, and made her an offer. He spoke of expansion, of lines of credit, of leveraging her success to build an empire that would dwarf Jedediah's. He saw her farm not as a living system, but as a scalable business model. He painted a picture of a massive operation with hundreds of acres and thousands of sheep, a fleet of new trucks, and a branded product in grocery stores across the state. Elara listened politely, a faint smile on her face. When he was finished with his grand proposal, she simply shook her head. My grandfather wrote that debt is the heaviest crop to raise, she told the bewildered banker. I plan to grow, but I'll grow the way the land can grow, not the way a bank wants me to. She would let the demand pull her operation forward rather than taking on debt to push it. She would expand at the pace the earth dictated, season by season, just as the notebooks advised. That winter, Great Aunt Maeve's health began to fail. Elara visited her often, bringing her jars of honey from the hives she'd started and cuts of lamb that Maeve ate with quiet satisfaction. Maeve lived just long enough to see the full turning of the tide, to hear the stories of farmers lining up to learn from her grandniece. During one of their last visits, Elara was describing how Jedediah Stone was now teaching his own neighbors how to manage their pastures. Maeve, frail and fading in her bed, managed a small, dry chuckle. She reached out a hand, her skin as thin and translucent as parchment, and gripped Elara's arm with surprising strength. Good dirt, she rasped, her voice barely a whisper. That's all that ever mattered. Your granddad knew. Her eyes, though clouded, held a look of deep, final approval. She passed away a week later, peacefully in her sleep. Her death was not a tragedy, but a completion. It marked the final, quiet transfer of the wise elder's mantle from one generation to the next. Elara was no longer just the inheritor of the knowledge. She was now its keeper. 3 years after her first visit to the auction, Elara found herself there again. She wasn't buying or selling, just observing. The place was the same, the dust, the smells, the rhythmic chant of the auctioneer. But the atmosphere around her had fundamentally changed. She was no longer an invisible outsider. Farmers nodded to her with a deference and respect that still felt unfamiliar. Jedediah Stone, his own farm now smaller, smarter, and solvent, stood beside her, not as a mocker but as a colleague. At the end of the day, a small lot of thin, scraggly-looking calves were brought into the ring, the leftovers nobody wanted. A murmur went through the crowd, the old familiar sound of dismissive judgment. But this time it was hesitant. All eyes shifted subtly to Elara. They were watching her, waiting for her verdict. She saw a young farmer, a man she didn't know, looking at the calves with the same focused, analytical gaze she remembered having herself. He was ignoring the laughter, trying to read the story the animals told. Elara caught his eye across the dusty pen and gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. A quiet fell over the section. The young man raised his number. The auctioneer, surprised, slammed his gavel down. Sold, he said. This time no one laughed. The community, humbled by the hard truth of the drought, now understood the value of what she had seen all along. They had learned to look past the surface, to see the potential in the thing that had been rejected. The story of Burnt Fork Farm became a quiet legend in the county, a testament to a different kind of wealth. It was a story that proved that the rejected thing is often the most valuable thing, if only you have the eyes to see it and the patience to understand it. It was proof that attention beats force, that listening to the wisdom of the past is a more reliable guide to the future than the promises of the present. It showed that a farm is not a factory, but a partnership, and that the health of the land is the only true measure of a farmer's success. And it was a story that demonstrated, with the simple, irrefutable clarity of a green field in a brown and broken land, that true worth does not need to argue or boast. In the end, it simply proves itself.